October 1274. The waters off Tsushima Island turn dark with sails. More than 900 ships carrying 40,000 Mongol, Korean, and Chinese warriors close on the Japanese coast. The defenders on the beach, a few hundred samurai and their retainers, watch the horizon disappear beneath an invasion fleet larger than anything they have ever seen. Within hours, this small island will become the opening battlefield of what the Mongols believe will be their easiest conquest yet. They have already subjugated China, Korea, Central Asia, and half of Europe. Japan, they assume, will fall in weeks. The samurai on Tsushima have no illusions about what is coming. They know the reputation of the Mongol war machine. 30 years earlier, Mongol cavalry shattered the largest army Hungary could field in a single afternoon at Mohi. They burned Kiev. They forced the Korean kingdom to submit after decades of resistance. Their system of conquest is brutally efficient. Overwhelming force, coordinated maneuver, psychological terror, and the complete annihilation of resistance. When Mongol envoys arrived in Japan 3 years ago demanding submission, the Japanese leadership understood the threat. But understanding a threat and stopping it are different things. Here is what makes this story different from almost every other account of the Mongol invasions. Japan's survival did not depend on a divine wind, samurai heroism, or impossible luck. It depended on a structural factor that the Mongols had never encountered before and could not overcome: fortified coastal defense systems combined with the logistical impossibility of supplying a massive amphibious invasion across open ocean against a prepared, dug-in defender. That factor was not present in 1274. It would only emerge after catastrophic defeat forced the Japanese to completely redesign their defensive strategy. What happened at Tsushima was not a victory. It was a slaughter that taught the Japanese exactly how the Mongols fought, and exactly what they needed to do to survive the next invasion. The samurai commander on Tsushima is So Sukekuni, the island's governor. He commands perhaps 300 mounted warriors and another 500 foot soldiers. He knows he cannot win. His orders are simpler: delay the invasion, observe their tactics, and send word to Kyushu before the island falls. In medieval warfare, this kind of mission is a death sentence, and everyone on the beach knows it. But Sukekuni also knows that if the Mongols land unopposed, they will establish a forward base that gives them control of the strait between Korea and Japan. Every hour he holds them matters. The Mongol fleet does not waste time with negotiations. As the ships close on shore, archers begin loosing volleys from the decks. The samurai have faced arrows before, but not like this. Mongol composite bows outrange Japanese bows by 50 yards. The samurai cannot return fire effectively. Then the bombardment begins. Mongol ships carry ceramic bombs filled with gunpowder and shrapnel, thunder crash bombs that explode on impact. The Japanese have never seen explosive weapons. The blasts shatter formations, kill horses, and create chaos along the defensive line. Within minutes, the samurai realize they are fighting an enemy with capabilities they do not understand. The first wave of Mongol infantry hits the beach in coordinated units, not the individual duels the samurai expect. Mongol warfare is built on unit cohesion and mass tactics. Armoured infantry advance in tight blocks, supported by archers who maintain suppressing fire while the infantry closes distance. The samurai fight bravely, charging forward in small groups, calling out their lineage and accomplishments before engaging in single combat, exactly as their tradition demands. Against another samurai force this would be honourable and effective. Against the Mongols it is suicide. Mongol soldiers ignore the challenges, encircle isolated samurai and cut them down with coordinated spear thrusts and sword strikes. Within an hour the beach is littered with Japanese dead, so Sukekuni pulls his remaining forces back from the coast to a fortified position inland. He is buying time, not trying to win. Messengers are already riding south toward the mainland with reports of the invasion. Sukekuni's mission is nearly complete, but the Mongols are not interested in letting him escape. Over the next 2 days, Mongol forces sweep across Tsushima, burning villages, killing resistors, and hunting down the remaining samurai. Sukekuni makes a final stand at a fortified manor. He and his remaining warriors fight until they are overwhelmed. So Sukekuni dies with his men. Tsushima falls completely. 1 week later, the Mongol fleet moves south to Iki Island, the next stepping stone toward Kyushu. The garrison there, commanded by Taira Kagetaka, knows what happened at Tsushima. They know they cannot stop the Mongols. But like Sukekuni, Kagetaka's mission is to delay and observe. The pattern repeats. Mongol ships bombard the coast, infantry land in coordinated waves, and the samurai are crushed by superior numbers and unfamiliar tactics. Kagetaka and his men die defending the island. Iki falls in less than 3 days. Now the Mongol fleet crosses the final stretch of water to Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. The landing site is Hakata Bay, near modern-day Fukuoka. This is where the real invasion begins. The Mongols have cleared the outer defences. They have demonstrated their overwhelming superiority. They expect the Japanese to collapse as soon as a major land battle begins. What they do not expect is that the Japanese defenders at Hakata, despite being outnumbered and outmatched tactically, will fight with such ferocity and desperation that the Mongol advance stalls on the beach. On November 19th, 1274, the Mongol fleet anchors off Hakata Bay and begins landing troops. Waiting for them are several thousand samurai from Kyushu's warrior clans, hastily assembled after the fall of Tsushima and Iki. These samurai have received reports from the survivors who escaped the outer islands. They know the Mongols use explosive bombs. They know the Mongols fight in coordinated units. They know individual heroics will not work, but they have no alternative tactics, no time to prepare fortifications, and no experience fighting this kind of enemy. What they do have is desperation. If Hakata falls, the Mongols will have a secure beachhead on Japanese soil, and the invasion will become unstoppable. The fighting at Hakata is brutal and chaotic. The samurai charge the Mongol lines repeatedly, trying to break their formation through sheer aggression. Some of these charges succeed temporarily. Japanese warriors are skilled, heavily armoured, and willing to die. But the Mongols adapt quickly, using their archers to break up charges before they hit, then counter-attacking with infantry and cavalry once the samurai are scattered. The explosive bombs create terror and confusion, killing clusters of men and horses with each detonation. By nightfall, the beach is covered with dead from both sides, but the Mongols have established a foothold on shore. That night, something unexpected happens. The Mongol commanders order a withdrawal back to the ships. After a full day of fighting, with a beachhead secured and the Japanese defenders bloodied and disorganized, the Mongol force pulls back from the shore and returns to the fleet anchored in Hakata Bay. Japanese chroniclers later claim this retreat was caused by fear of samurai counterattacks or by early signs of an approaching storm. The reality is more mundane and more telling. The Mongol invasion force is not a conquest army. It is a reconnaissance in force, designed to test Japanese defences and establish whether a full-scale invasion is feasible. The commanders have seen enough. They know the Japanese will not submit without a major campaign, and the fleet is not equipped for a prolonged amphibious operation in late autumn. They withdraw to report back to Kublai Khan. What happens next seals the fate of the 1274 invasion. During the night, a storm strikes the fleet while it is anchored in open water. The storm is not the mythical typhoon of legend. It is a severe autumn gale, common in these waters during November. But common or not, it is devastating to a fleet crowded with ships that have been at sea for weeks and are now packed with troops, horses, and supplies in exposed anchorage. Ships collide in the darkness, anchors drag. Vessels are driven onto rocks or capsized by heavy swells. By dawn, dozens of ships have been lost and thousands of men have drowned. The Mongol fleet limps back to Korea, battered and demoralized. The invasion is over. Japan has survived, but not because of victory. The samurai lost every major engagement. Tsushima fell in 2 days. Iki fell in 3. The fighting at Hakata was desperate and inconclusive, saved only by the Mongol withdrawal. The storm destroyed what remained of the Mongol fleet, but storms are not a military strategy. Japanese commanders know this. They know the Mongols will return with a larger force, better prepared, and they know that without fundamental changes to Japanese defensive strategy, the next invasion will succeed. The 1274 invasion was a warning. The question is whether Japan can learn from it in time. The man who understands this most clearly is Hojo Tokimune, the regent who rules Japan in the name of the emperor. Tokimune is 23 years old when the first invasion strikes. He is not a field commander, his power is political and administrative, but he grasps the strategic problem immediately. Japan cannot defeat the Mongols in open battle. The samurai are brave and skilled, but they fight as individuals, not as coordinated units. They have no experience with explosive weapons, no answer to massed archery, and no fortifications along the coast. If the Mongols return with a larger fleet and establish a permanent beachhead, Japanese forces will be ground down through attrition. Tokumun's solution is not to train better warriors or find a miracle weapon. His solution is to remove the battlefield advantage that makes Mongol tactics effective in the first place. He orders the construction of a massive defensive wall along Hakata Bay. This decision is more radical than it sounds. Medieval Japan does not have a tradition of static coastal fortifications. Castles exist, but they are inland strongholds designed to control territory and withstand siege. The idea of building a long stone wall along a beach to prevent an amphibious landing is almost unprecedented in Japanese military architecture. But Tokumun is not interested in tradition. He is interested in survival. The wall will serve a simple, brutal purpose. Deny the Mongols a landing site where they can deploy their cavalry, form their infantry blocks, and bring their superior numbers to bear. Force them to assault a fortified position directly from the sea, where their mobility and coordination advantages disappear. Construction begins in 1275, immediately after the first invasion. The project is enormous. The wall must stretch for miles along the entire coastline of Hakata Bay. It must be tall enough to block cavalry charges and thick enough to withstand bombardment. It must be built quickly, because no one knows when the Mongols will return. Tokumun mobilizes the entire labor force of Kyushu, peasant conscripts, samurai retainers, monks, craftsmen, and sets them to work hauling stone, digging foundations, and raising the wall section by section. The work continues for months, then years. The wall grows slowly, consuming vast amounts of resources and labor, but it grows. While the wall rises, Tokumun makes a second critical decision. He reorganizes the command structure of the Japanese defense. During the 1274 invasion, samurai clans fought independently, each under its own lord, with no unified command and no coordination. This made tactical adaptation impossible. Tokumun centralizes authority under a single military commander and establishes a clear hierarchy for the defense of Kyushu. He also begins stockpiling supplies, arrows, armor, weapons, food, along the coast, so that defenders can sustain a prolonged battle without waiting for reinforcements from the interior. These are logistical and administrative reforms, not heroic gestures, but they are exactly what Japan needs. By 1281, 7 years after the first invasion, the entire defensive system is designed to do one thing: turn an amphibious landing into a killing ground. The Mongols will not be able to ride their horses off the ships and form cavalry lines. They will have to assault the wall directly under arrow fire, with no room to maneuver and no way to bring their numerical superiority to bear. The battlefield has been redesigned. Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor, has been preparing as well. He has not forgotten Japan. The 1274 invasion was a failure, but it was also a learning experience. Kublai now knows that Japan will not submit without a fight, and he knows that a small raiding force is not enough. He orders the construction of a new invasion fleet, vastly larger than the first. This time, there will be no reconnaissance mission. This time, the Mongol Empire will bring overwhelming force and crush Japanese resistance permanently. The new fleet will carry over 140,000 men, Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, Korean sailors, siege engineers, and supply personnel. It will be the largest amphibious invasion in history until the modern era. The scale of this operation is staggering. Building and provisioning a fleet large enough to transport 140,000 men across open ocean requires years of preparation. Kublai commandeers the entire shipbuilding capacity of southern China and Korea. Forests are cleared for timber. Grain stockpiles are requisitioned to feed the invasion force. Horses are gathered by the thousands. The logistics of this campaign are more complex than any previous Mongol operation, because the Mongols are fundamentally a land-based empire. They can conquer anything they can reach on horseback, but amphibious warfare is outside their expertise. They are learning as they go, and the strain is enormous. By early 1281, the fleet is ready. It is divided into two separate armadas. The first, the Eastern Route Army, will depart from Korea with 40,000 troops, mostly Mongol and Korean soldiers. The second, the Southern Route Army, will depart from southern China with 100,000 troops, mostly Chinese infantry. The two fleets will converge on Kyushu and launch a coordinated invasion, overwhelming the Japanese defences through sheer numbers. The plan is sound in theory. In practice, coordinating two separate fleets over hundreds of miles of ocean, with no reliable communication, and no experience in naval logistics is a recipe for disaster. The Eastern Route Army departs Korea in May 1281. It crosses to Tsushima and Iki, expecting to find the islands lightly defended as they were in 1274. Instead, the Mongols encounter fortified positions and organized resistance. The Japanese have learned. The islands do not fall in days this time. The defenders hold out for weeks, forcing the Mongols to commit significant forces to sieges that should have been quick victories. By the time the Eastern Route Army secures the islands and moves toward Kyushu, they are behind schedule, and the Southern Route Army has not yet arrived from China. When the Eastern Route fleet reaches Akata Bay in June, the Mongol commanders see the wall for the first time. It stretches along the entire coastline, a stone barrier that makes a direct landing impossible. The Mongols attempt several probing assaults, sending troops ashore in small boats to test the defences. Each time they are met with concentrated arrow fire from behind the wall. Samurai defenders, protected by stone fortifications and fighting from prepared positions, repel every landing attempt. The Mongols lose hundreds of men in these failed assaults and gain nothing. Without a beachhead, they cannot bring their cavalry ashore, cannot form their infantry blocks, cannot deploy their siege engines. The wall has done exactly what Tokumun intended. It has negated the Mongol advantage. The Eastern Route commanders pull back and wait for the Southern Route Army to arrive. The plan now is to combine forces and launch a massive simultaneous assault that will overwhelm the wall through sheer numbers. But the Southern Route Army is delayed. Poor winds, logistical problems, and the sheer difficulty of coordinating 100,000 men across a fleet of ships have slowed their progress. Weeks pass. The Eastern Route Army sits at anchor off Kyushu, unable to advance, burning through supplies and watching the Japanese defenders grow stronger behind their wall. Then, in mid-June, Japanese small boats begin launching nighttime raids against the anchored Mongol fleet. Then, in mid-June, Japanese small boats begin launching nighttime raids against the anchored Mongol fleet. These are not large-scale naval battles. The Japanese have no fleet capable of confronting the Mongol armada directly. These are commando-style attacks, executed by small teams of samurai in lightweight boats that can maneuver quickly in the dark. They approach the Mongol ships silently, board them, kill the crew, set fires, and escape before reinforcements arrive. The raids are terrifying and effective. Mongol soldiers crammed onto ships with nowhere to retreat wake to find their vessels burning and Japanese warriors cutting through the decks. Dozens of ships are lost this way. The Mongol fleet, already strained by weeks of waiting at anchor, begins to suffer from low morale and exhaustion. The Japanese are learning to fight a defensive war. They cannot match the Mongols in open battle, but they can make every landing attempt costly, every night at anchor dangerous, and every supply line vulnerable. The wall is the foundation of this strategy, but the nighttime raids are the exploitation. The Mongols are discovering that controlling the sea does not mean controlling the landing, and that numerical superiority means nothing if you cannot bring your forces to bear on the battlefield. This is the logistical nightmare of amphibious warfare, and the Mongols have never faced it before. Finally, in late June, the Southern Route Army arrives from China. The two fleets combine off the coast of Kyushu, creating an armada of over 4,000 ships carrying more than 140,000 men. It is the largest invasion force ever assembled in East Asia. The Mongol commanders now have the numbers to attempt a frontal assault on the wall. They plan a massive coordinated landing, waves of infantry hitting the beach simultaneously at multiple points, overwhelming the defenders through sheer mass, then breaking through the wall and establishing a secure beachhead inland. If the assault succeeds, the war is over. If it fails, the entire invasion is at risk. The assault begins in early July. Mongol ships move in close to shore and begin bombarding the wall with catapults and explosive bombs. The bombardment is intense, but the wall holds. Stone absorbs the impact better than flesh, and the Japanese defenders stay behind cover until the bombardment lifts. Then the landing craft launch. Thousands of Mongol soldiers row toward the beach in waves, packed into boats, exposed to Japanese archers the entire way. The defenders unleash volley after volley, boats capsize, men drown in their armour. Those who reach the shore find themselves trapped between the water and the wall, with no room to form ranks and no cover from the arrows raining down from above. Some Mongol units manage to reach the base of the wall and attempt to scale it or tear down sections of the palisade. Hand-to-hand fighting breaks out along the top of the wall, brutal and desperate. Samurai defenders swing swords and spears down at climbing soldiers. Mongol troops hurl grappling hooks, and try to pull defenders off the wall. For hours, the battle rages along a narrow strip of contested ground. But the Japanese hold. The wall does not break. By nightfall, the Mongol assault has stalled. Thousands of men are dead on the beach, and the invasion force has gained no ground. The Mongol commanders pull back to reassess. They have the numbers to keep trying, but each assault costs lives and consumes supplies. The fleet is running low on food and fresh water. The men are exhausted. The original plan assumed a quick victory, secure a beachhead, push inland, and force Japanese surrender within weeks. That plan is no longer viable. The wall has turned Hakata Bay into a fortress, and the Japanese are not collapsing. The Mongols need a new strategy, but their options are limited. They cannot sail around Kyushu and land elsewhere. The southern and western coasts are even more difficult terrain, and the Japanese would simply move their forces to defend any new landing site. They cannot sustain a prolonged siege from the sea. Their supply lines stretch back to Korea and China, and they are already struggling to feed the invasion force. The Mongol commanders make a decision that reveals their desperation. They order the fleet to withdraw from Hakata Bay and regroup at Takashima, a small island off the coast. The plan is to rest the troops, resupply from the ships, and prepare for another assault. But moving the entire fleet to Takashima creates a new problem. The island's anchorage is not large enough to safely hold 4,000 ships, so the fleet is forced to anchor in open water, exposed to the weather. It is now mid-July, and the storm season is beginning. For 2 weeks, the Mongol fleet sits at Takashima, waiting for orders. The commanders debate whether to attempt another assault on Hakata, or to withdraw entirely and regroup for a third invasion attempt next year. Supplies are critically low. Morale is collapsing. Disease is spreading through the crowded ships. The Japanese, meanwhile, continue their nighttime raids, picking off isolated vessels and keeping the Mongol fleet on constant alert. The invasion is falling apart not because of a single decisive battle, but because of accumulated logistical failure. The Mongols can win battles, but they cannot sustain an amphibious campaign against a fortified defender. On August 15th, 1281, a typhoon strikes the fleet at Takashima. This is the storm that will be remembered as the kamikaze, the divine wind, and it is real. Unlike the 1274 gale, which was a severe but manageable autumn storm, the 1281 typhoon is a catastrophic weather event. Winds reach over 100 miles per hour. Waves rise higher than the masts of the ships. The Mongol fleet, packed tightly in open anchorage with nowhere to run, is destroyed. Ships are torn from their anchors and driven into each other, splintering hulls and snapping masts. Vessels capsize and sink within minutes, dragging thousands of men down with them. Those who survive the initial impact cling to wreckage or swim desperately toward shore, only to drown in the chaos or be crushed by debris. The storm lasts for 2 days. When it finally passes, more than half the invasion fleet is gone. The survivors, perhaps 60,000 men, are stranded on Takashima and the nearby coast, separated from their ships, with no supplies and no way to escape. Japanese forces quickly move in to finish them. What follows is not a battle, but a massacre. Samurai units sweep through the survivors, hunting down Mongol soldiers hiding in forests and caves, killing prisoners, and burning what remains of the beached ships. The Mongol commanders who survived the storm attempt to organize a retreat back to Korea and China, but without ships, there is no retreat. Most of the invasion force dies on Takashima, or in the waters around it. Only a few thousand men make it back to the mainland, scattered across fishing boats and damaged vessels. The 1281 invasion is over. The Mongol Empire has suffered one of the greatest military disasters in its history. Over 100,000 men are dead or captured. The fleet is annihilated. Kublai Khan will never attempt another invasion of Japan. The cost is too high, the logistics too complex, and the failure too complete. Japanese chroniclers attribute the victory to the kamikaze, the divine wind sent by the gods to protect Japan from foreign invasion. This narrative is understandable. The storm did destroy the Mongol fleet, and without the storm, the outcome might have been different. But the storm alone did not save Japan. The storm destroyed a fleet that was already failing. The Mongol invasion was collapsing before the typhoon hit, undone by the wall at Hakata Bay, by the nighttime raids, by the logistical impossibility of sustaining a massive amphibious force across open ocean against a prepared defender. The storm delivered the final blow, but the Japanese defensive strategy had already turned the invasion into an unwinnable campaign. This is the critical lesson of Tsushima and the Mongol invasions. Preparation and structural defense can defeat even the most powerful military force in the world if the defender understands the battlefield and redesigns it to negate the attacker's advantages. The Japanese did not win because their warriors were better. They won because they recognized, after catastrophic defeat in 1274, that they could not fight the Mongols on Mongol terms. They needed to change the terms of the battle itself. Let us go back now to where this story begins. Not in 1281, not even in 1274, but decades earlier, to understand how the Mongol Empire became the unstoppable force that nearly conquered Japan, and why Japan was the one target that proved too difficult to reach. The Mongol Empire in the 13th century is not simply a large empire. It is the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. At its peak, it controls more territory than Rome, more than Alexander's conquests, more than any empire before or since. This expansion happens in less than a century, driven by a military system so effective that it defeats. The Mongol military advantage begins with mobility. Mongol armies move faster than any other force in the medieval world. A Mongol cavalry unit can cover 60 miles in a single day, carrying everything it needs on horseback. Compare this to a European or Chinese army, which might cover 15 miles per day while dragging supply wagons and infantry columns. This speed allows Mongol forces to outmaneuver enemies, strike before defences are ready, and retreat before counterattacks can form. When the Mongols invaded Hungary in 1241, European commanders could not understand how Mongol columns appeared simultaneously in multiple locations hundreds of miles apart. The answer was simple. Mongol cavalry travelled faster than information, but speed alone does not explain Mongol success. The second advantage is coordination. Mongol armies fight as integrated units, with every soldier trained to follow complex maneuvers in the middle of battle. A Mongol cavalry charge is not a chaotic rush. It is a precisely timed series of feints, flanking movements, and concentrated strikes, all coordinated through flag signals and drum commands. Mongol generals use a decimal organization system: squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, divisions of 10,000. Every soldier knows his place in the formation and can execute orders instantly. This level of discipline is rare in medieval warfare, where most armies are loose collections of feudal levies with minimal training. The third advantage is combined arms. Mongol forces integrate light cavalry, heavy cavalry, and archers into a single tactical system. Light cavalry scouts ahead, harasses enemy formations, and draws them into traps. Heavy cavalry delivers the killing blow once the enemy is disrupted. Archers provide suppressing fire throughout, killing commanders and breaking morale before the melee begins. Western and Chinese armies often separate their cavalry and infantry into distinct units that fight independently. The Mongols make them work together, creating a battlefield synergy that multiplies their effectiveness. Add to this the Mongol approach to siege warfare. Early in their expansion, the Mongols had no experience besieging fortified cities. They were steppe nomads, used to fighting in open terrain. But when they encountered the walled cities of China and Central Asia, they adapted. They recruited Chinese and Persian engineers, learned to build siege towers and catapults, and developed tactics for starving out defenders and undermining walls. By the time they reached Europe, Mongol armies could reduce heavily fortified cities in weeks. When they sacked Baghdad in 1258, they breached walls that had stood for 5 centuries. When they took Kiev in 1240, they left the city in ruins. The psychological component of Mongol warfare is just as important as the tactical. The Mongols use terror as a weapon. Cities that resist are annihilated, population slaughtered, buildings burned, survivors enslaved. Cities that surrender immediately are usually spared, though forced to pay tribute and provide troops. This creates a brutal calculus for defenders: resist and die, or submit and survive. Many cities choose submission. The Mongol reputation spreads faster than their armies, and by the time Mongol forces arrive at a city's gates, the defenders are already demoralized. This is the force that turns toward Japan in the 1270s. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, has completed the conquest of China, subjugated Korea, and established himself as emperor of the Yuan dynasty. Japan is the last unconquered kingdom in East Asia. Kublai sends envoys in 1268, demanding that Japan submit to Mongol authority and pay tribute. The message is clear: acknowledge Mongol supremacy or face invasion. The Japanese leadership, centered in Kamakura under the Hojo regents, refuses. They understand what Mongol submission means: loss of sovereignty, tribute payments, forced military service in future Mongol campaigns. They choose resistance. But choosing to resist and being able to resist are different things. Japan in 1274 is not militarily prepared for a Mongol invasion. The Japanese military system is built around samurai warriors, heavily armored cavalry who fight as individual champions, not as coordinated units. Samurai warfare is ritualized and personal. Before a battle, warriors announce their lineage, challenge opponents to single combat, and fight for individual glory. This system works well in the clan conflicts and civil wars that dominate Japanese history, but it is completely unsuited to fighting the Mongols. Mongol soldiers do not care about honor duels. They fight in formations, use mass tactics, and focus on killing enemies efficiently rather than honorably. Japan also lacks experience with the weapons and tactics the Mongols bring. Japanese armies have archers, but their bows are optimized for short-range accuracy, not the long-range suppressing fire that Mongol composite bows deliver. Japanese forces have no equivalent to Mongol explosive bombs, no experience with coordinated cavalry charges, and no fortifications designed to stop an amphibious landing. When the first Mongol invasion strikes Tsushima in October 1274, the Japanese defenders are not just outnumbered, they are outmatched in every tactical dimension. The fall of Tsushima is instructive because it shows exactly how the Mongol system works. So Sukekuni, the island's commander, has perhaps 800 men total. 300 mounted samurai and 500 foot soldiers. The Mongol force landing on the island numbers over 10,000. But the disparity in numbers is not the decisive factor. The decisive factor is that Sukekuni's men fight as individuals while the Mongols fight as a coordinated army. When samurai charge forward to engage in single combat, Mongol infantry encircle them and cut them down. When samurai try to rally behind defensive positions, Mongol archers suppress them with long-range fire, then explosive bombs shatter their formations. Sukekuni's men are brave and skilled, but bravery and skill do not compensate for tactical obsolescence. Tsushima falls in 2 days. Iki Island falls in 3. When the Mongol fleet reaches Hakata Bay on Kyushu, the pattern repeats. Japanese defenders charge the Mongol lines in small groups, expecting individual combat. The Mongols respond with coordinated volleys, encircling maneuvers, and explosive bombardment. The samurai suffer devastating casualties. Only the Mongol withdrawal and the subsequent storm prevent a complete Japanese collapse in 1274. The invasion ends not because Japan won, but because the Mongols chose to leave and then lost their fleet to weather. The Japanese leadership understands this. Hojo Tsokimune, the regent, knows that the 1274 result was not a victory, it was a warning. The Mongols will return, and when they do, they will bring a larger force. If Japan tries to fight them the same way, the outcome will be different. Tokimune's genius is recognizing that Japan cannot win by becoming better at what the Mongols already do better. Japan needs to fight a different kind of war entirely. This is where the wall comes in. The wall at Hakata Bay is not just a physical barrier, it is a strategic redefinition of the battlefield. In open terrain, Mongol cavalry can maneuver freely, Mongol archers can maintain suppressing fire, and Mongol infantry can execute complex coordinated attacks. Behind a fortified wall, all of those advantages disappear. Cavalry cannot charge uphill into stone. Archers shooting at defenders behind cover lose their effectiveness. Infantry assaulting a fortified position cannot use maneuver. They can only attack directly into concentrated defensive fire. The wall forces the Mongols to fight on Japanese terms, not Mongol terms. The construction of the wall takes 7 years, from 1275 to 1281. It is not a perfect fortification. There are gaps, weak points, sections that are lower or less well built than others, but it does not need to be perfect. It only needs to deny the Mongols a clear landing site where they can deploy their forces effectively, and it succeeds. When the second invasion arrives in 1281, the Mongol commanders find themselves unable to establish a beachhead. Every assault on the wall fails, every landing attempt is repelled. The invasion stalls, and once it stalls, logistics begin to work against the Mongols. This is the hidden factor that destroys the 1281 invasion even before the typhoon hits. This is the hidden factor that destroys the 1281 invasion even before the typhoon hits. The Mongols are trying to sustain 140,000 men across a supply line that stretches hundreds of miles over open ocean, with no secure base, no ability to forage locally, and no fallback position. Every day the fleet sits at anchor off Kyushu. The invasion force consumes tons of food and fresh water that must be brought from Korea and China. Amphibious invasions are among the most difficult military operations to execute, even with modern technology. Without modern ships, reliable navigation, or mechanized supply systems, they border on impossible. The Mongols are attempting something no empire has successfully done at this scale: transport a massive army across open ocean, land it against organized resistance, and sustain it in hostile territory without a secure port or supply depot. The Romans never attempted an invasion of this magnitude across water. The Chinese dynasties never projected force overseas at this scale. The Mongols are improvising, and the strain shows in every aspect of the 1281 campaign. Consider the logistics of feeding 140,000 men at sea. Each soldier requires roughly 2 pounds of food per day. Rice, dried meat, salted fish, whatever can be stored on ships for weeks without spoiling. That is over 100 tons of food consumed daily. The horses require even more. Each horse needs 10 to 15 pounds of fodder per day, and the Mongol cavalry brought thousands of horses. Add in fresh water, which cannot be obtained at sea and must be stored in barrels. A fleet of this size burns through its supplies in weeks, not months. The original plan assumed a quick victory: land at Hakata, break through Japanese defences, establish a forward base with access to local food and water, then push inland. None of that happens. When the wall stops the initial assault, the Mongol fleet is forced to remain at anchor, waiting for a breakthrough that never comes. Supplies dwindle. Sailors and soldiers begin suffering from malnutrition and dehydration. The fleet cannot simply return to Korea or China to resupply and try again, because the round trip takes weeks, and dispersing the invasion force would mean starting the entire operation over. The Mongol commanders are trapped between two bad options: continue the assault and risk losing the entire army to starvation, or withdraw and admit defeat. They choose a middle option: relocate to Takashima and regroup, but this only delays the inevitable. The move to Takashima in late July is the moment the invasion becomes doomed, even without the typhoon. Takashima's anchorage is not designed to hold 4,000 ships. The fleet is forced to spread out in open water, vulnerable to weather and to Japanese raids. Supplies are still critically low. The men are exhausted and demoralized. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, have held their ground and are growing more confident. The Mongol commanders know they cannot sustain this position indefinitely, but they also cannot admit failure and return to face Kublai Khan empty-handed. They are paralyzed by indecision, and the invasion rots at anchor. When the typhoon strikes on August 15th, it destroys a fleet that is already on the verge of collapse. The storm is devastating. Winds over 100 miles per hour, waves higher than the ship's masts. But the reason it is so catastrophic is that the fleet is anchored in the worst possible location, with no ability to maneuver or seek shelter. A properly harboured fleet might have survived the storm with heavy losses. The Mongol fleet, exposed in open water and already weakened by weeks of failed operations, is annihilated. Over half the ships are destroyed. More than 70,000 men drown or are killed in the aftermath. The survivors are stranded on hostile shores with no escape. The Japanese do not wait to see if the survivors can reorganize. Samurai forces move in immediately, hunting down Mongol soldiers on Takashima and the nearby coast. There is no mercy. The Mongols had massacred the defenders of Tsushima and Iki in 1274, and the Japanese repay that brutality in full. Thousands of Mongol soldiers are killed while trying to surrender. Others are driven into the sea or hunted through the forests. Within weeks, the invasion force is destroyed. Only scattered remnants make it back to Korea and China, carrying news of the disaster. Kublai Khan receives the reports of the 1281 failure with fury and disbelief. The Mongol Empire has never suffered a defeat of this magnitude. Kublai has poured years of resources into the invasion: ships, soldiers, supplies, treasure, and has nothing to show for it except staggering losses. He orders preparations for a third invasion, determined to conquer Japan and erase the humiliation. But the third invasion never happens. The cost is too high. The logistics are too complex. The risk of another catastrophic failure is too great. Kublai's advisors convince him to abandon the campaign and focus on consolidating his control over China. Japan remains The question is why? Why did the Mongols, who defeated the largest armies China could field, who crushed the Khwarezmian Empire, who destroyed the Kingdom of Hungary, fail against Japan? The easy answer is the typhoon, the divine wind that saved Japan from foreign invasion. But this answer is incomplete. The typhoon destroyed the fleet, but the invasion was already failing before the storm hit. The wall at Hakata Bay had stopped the landing. The Japanese nighttime raids had degraded Mongol morale and reduced their effective strength. The logistical strain of sustaining a massive amphibious force without a secure base had crippled the invasion's ability to operate. The typhoon was the final blow, but it struck a campaign that was already dying. The real reason the Mongols failed is that Japan changed the nature of the battlefield. The Mongols excelled at open-field maneuver warfare on land. They could outflank, encircle, and overwhelm any enemy in open terrain, but they could not overcome a fortified coastal defense backed by a determined population willing to fight from prepared positions. The wall negated Mongol mobility. The nighttime raids exploited Mongol vulnerability at sea. The logistical impossibility of sustaining the invasion over time meant that every day the Japanese held out, the Mongol position grew weaker. Japan did not win by being stronger. Japan won by making the Mongols fight a kind of war they could not win. This is the lesson that echoes through military history. Superior tactics and technology mean nothing if you cannot bring them to bear on the battlefield. The Mongols had superior cavalry, superior archery, superior coordination, but none of that mattered if they could not land their forces and establish a base of operations. The Japanese defensive strategy was not about defeating the Mongols in battle. It was about preventing the Mongols from ever establishing the conditions that would allow their tactical superiority to function. Deny the landing, force the enemy to fight from a position of weakness, exploit the logistical vulnerabilities inherent in amphibious warfare. These principles are as relevant in 1281 as they are in any modern conflict involving contested landings. Now let us turn to the campaign itself, step by step, and see how these strategic principles played out in the actions of commanders, soldiers, and sailors on both sides. The story of the Mongol invasions is not just about a wall and a storm, it is about decisions made under pressure, mistakes compounded over time, and the brutal reality of what happens when a military force tries to operate beyond the limits of its logistical capacity. The Eastern Route Army departs from Korea in May 1281 under the command of Mongol General Arakan and Korean General Hong Dagu. 40,000 men, mostly Mongol and Korean soldiers, packed into 900 ships. The fleet crosses the strait towards Tsushima, retracing the route of the 1274 invasion. The commanders expect the outer islands to fall quickly, just as they did 7 years earlier. What they find instead is resistance that has learned from the first invasion. The Japanese have fortified Tsushima. Small garrisons have been reinforced. Coastal watchtowers have been built to provide early warning. The defences are not strong enough to stop the Mongol landing, but they are strong enough to delay it. The Mongols come ashore on Tsushima in early June and face organised resistance from samurai units that do not charge recklessly into individual combat. The defenders have adjusted their tactics. They fight from defensive positions, use archers to harass landing parties, and retreat in order when overwhelmed rather than standing to die in place. The island still falls. The Mongol numerical advantage is too great, but it takes days instead of hours, and the Mongols lose men and time they cannot afford to lose. The pattern repeats at Iki Island. The defenders hold out longer than expected. The Mongol advance slows. By the time the Eastern Route Army reaches Hakata Bay in mid-June, they are behind schedule. The Southern Route Army, which was supposed to depart from China in May and arrive at Kyushu simultaneously, has not yet appeared. The Eastern Route commanders face a choice: wait for the Southern Army and risk losing momentum, or attempt an assault on Hakata with the forces they have. They choose to wait, but they also launch probing attacks to test the Japanese defences. This is when they discover the wall. The wall is not what the Mongol commanders expected. Intelligence from the 1274 invasion reported that Hakata Bay was lightly fortified, with no major defensive structures along the coast. Now, stretching along the entire shoreline, is a stone barrier 10 feet high, reinforced with wooden palisades and backed by dug-in defensive positions. The Mongols send landing parties to probe for weak points. Every attempt is repelled. Archers behind the wall have clear fields of fire. The beach offers no cover. Any force that lands is trapped between the water and the wall, unable to maneuver, unable to form ranks, exposed to concentrated defensive fire from above. The Mongol commanders pull back and send word to the Southern Route Army. We need the full invasion force to break through. The Southern Route Army, meanwhile, is struggling with its own problems. 100,000 men, over 3,000 ships departing from ports scattered along the southern coast of China. The logistical challenge of assembling this fleet is staggering. Ships are built hastily, using green timber that is not properly seasoned. Crews are recruited from coastal provinces with no naval experience. Troops are drawn from Chinese conscripts who have no loyalty to the Mongol cause and no desire to die invading a foreign country. The fleet is massive, but it is also fragile and poorly organized. Delays pile up. Supplies are loaded inefficiently. Coordination between different ports breaks down. The Southern Army does not depart in May as planned. It departs in late June, already a month behind schedule. When the Southern Route Army finally arrives off the coast of Kyushu in late June, the two fleets combine into a single armada of over 4,000 ships carrying 140,000 men. It is the largest invasion force assembled in the medieval world. The sight of it from the shore must have been overwhelming. The horizon covered with sails, the sea packed with vessels as far as the eye can see. The Japanese defenders know they are outnumbered more than 10 to 1. They know the Mongols can bring overwhelming force to bear if they establish a beachhead. But they also know the wall has held so far, and as long as it holds, the numbers do not matter. The combined Mongol command plans a massive coordinated assault for early July. The strategy is straightforward. Hit the wall at multiple points simultaneously with waves of infantry, overwhelm the defenders through sheer mass, break through at the weakest points, and establish a foothold on the beach. Once Mongol forces are ashore in strength, they can push inland, and the Japanese defensive line will collapse. The plan is sound in theory, but it assumes that the wall can be broken through sheer numbers. It does not account for the reality that assaulting a fortified position from the sea, with no cover and no room to maneuver, is a tactical nightmare even for a superior force. The assault begins with bombardment. Mongol ships move in close to shore and launch catapult stones and explosive bombs at the wall. The bombardment lasts for hours, intended to soften the defences and demoralise the Japanese. Some sections of the wall are damaged, palisades are shattered, and defenders are killed by exploding projectiles. But the wall itself, built from massive stone blocks and packed earth, absorbs the impact. Unlike wooden fortifications, which can be set on fire or smashed apart, stone walls require sustained battering to breach. The Mongol bombardment causes damage but does not create the openings the commanders hoped for. Then the landing craft launch. Thousands of soldiers packed into boats rowing toward the beach under arrow fire. The Japanese archers wait until the boats are in close range, then unleash concentrated volleys. Arrows strike men packed shoulder to shoulder with nowhere to dodge. Boats capsize as wounded rowers lose control. Those who reach the shore find themselves pinned against the base of the wall, unable to advance, unable to retreat, under constant fire from above. Some Mongol soldiers carry ladders and attempt to scale the wall. Samurai defenders meet them at the top with swords and spears. Bodies pile up along the base of the wall. The assault continues for hours, wave after wave, but the wall does not break. By nightfall on the first day of the assault, the Mongol commanders realize they have gained nothing. Thousands of men are dead or wounded. The wall is still standing. The Japanese defenders, though bloodied, have held every position. The Mongol fleet pulls back to regroup. The commanders hold a council. Some argue for continuing the assault. Eventually, sheer numbers will overwhelm the defense. Others point out that every day of assault burns through supplies and men without achieving results. The debate goes on through the night. No clear decision is reached. Over the next week, the Mongols launch several more assaults on the wall, each following the same pattern: bombardment, landing, fighting at the base of the wall, repulse. Each assault costs lives and gains nothing. The Japanese defenders are exhausted and taking casualties, but they are fighting from prepared positions with supply lines that run directly inland. The Mongols are fighting from ships, burning through food and water that must be rationed carefully. Morale on the Mongol side begins to crack. Soldiers who survived the assaults return to the ships demoralized and traumatized. The Chinese conscripts, who never wanted to be part of this invasion, begin to question why they are dying for Mongol ambitions. Then the Japanese nighttime raids begin. Small boats, crewed by samurai volunteers, slip out from shore after dark and approach the anchored Mongol fleet. The raiders board ships, kill the crew, set fires, and escape before Mongol reinforcements can respond. The raids are devastating not because they destroy large numbers of ships, they do not, but because they create paranoia and exhaustion. Every night the Mongol fleet is on alert, expecting attack. Soldiers sleep in their armour. Sentries watch the darkness, jumping at every sound. The psychological toll accumulates. The fleet, already strained by failed assaults and dwindling supplies, begins to lose cohesion. By mid-July, the Mongol invasion is in crisis. The eastern and southern route commanders hold another council aboard the flagship anchored off Kyushu. The reports are grim. Supplies are running critically low. The fleet has been at sea for over a month, far longer than planned, and the daily consumption of food and water is outstripping what remains in the stores. Disease is spreading through the crowded ships. Dysentery, likely caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, is killing dozens of men each day. Morale is collapsing, especially among the Chinese conscripts, who see no reason to continue dying for an invasion that has produced nothing but failure. The commanders face a decision: continue the assault and risk losing the army to starvation and disease, or withdraw and regroup. Neither option is acceptable. Continuing the assault means throwing more men at a wall that has already repelled every attempt to breach it, with no guarantee of success and the certainty of mounting losses. Withdrawing means returning to Kublai Khan and admitting that the largest invasion force in Mongol history failed to conquer a single island. The commanders choose a middle path. They order the fleet to relocate to Takashima, a small island southwest of Hakata Bay, where the anchorage offers slightly better protection and where the troops can rest and resupply from what remains in the ships. The plan is to regroup, wait for conditions to improve, and then launch one final assault on Hakata with whatever strength remains. It is a plan born of desperation, and it seals the invasion's fate. The move to Takashima happens in late July. The fleet weighs anchor and sails south, a slow and chaotic process involving thousands of ships with no central coordination. Some vessels become separated, others are left behind with damaged rigging or insufficient crew. The Japanese watch the fleet depart and do not pursue. They know the Mongols are retreating, and they are content to let them go. The samurai defenders at Hakata Bay have held their ground for over a month. They have repelled every assault. They have survived the bombardment and the waves of landing attempts. The wall has done what Hoyo Tokumun designed it to do: turn the battlefield into a killing ground that negates Mongol tactical advantages. At Takashima, the Mongol fleet anchors in open water because the island's small harbour cannot accommodate 4,000 ships. This is a critical mistake, one that will prove fatal. Open anchorage leaves the fleet exposed to weather and to continued Japanese raids. The ships are packed closely together, hull to hull in some places, because there is nowhere else to put them. The men are exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. Supplies are almost gone. The commanders ration what remains and send messages back to Korea and China requesting resupply ships, but resupply will take weeks to arrive and the fleet cannot wait weeks. The invasion is running on borrowed time. The Japanese nighttime raids continue at Takashima. Samurai volunteers operating from nearby coastal villages launch their small boats after dark and strike at the anchored fleet. The raids are hit-and-run operations. Board a ship, kill the crew, set it on fire, escape into the darkness. The Mongol fleet tries to defend against the raids by posting extra sentries and maintaining armed patrols in small boats between the anchored ships, but the darkness and the sheer size of the fleet make it impossible to stop every attack. Each successful raid burns another ship, kills more men, and deepens the sense that the invasion is falling apart. Meanwhile, conditions aboard the ships deteriorate. The men are packed into vessels designed for transport, not long-term habitation. There is no space to move, no privacy, no escape from the heat and the stench. Fresh water is nearly gone. What remains is stale and brackish, rationed to a few mouthfuls per man per day. Food is reduced to hardtack and dried fish, and even that is running out. Dysentery spreads unchecked. Men too sick to stand lie in the bilges, unable to receive treatment because there is no medicine and no space for a hospital. Morale collapses. Soldiers begin to desert, jumping overboard and swimming toward shore. preferring to take their chances with the Japanese rather than die slowly on a crowded ship. The Mongol commanders know the situation is unsustainable, but they are paralyzed by indecision. Returning to Korea or China without victory means facing Kublai Khan's wrath. Continuing the invasion means losing the army to attrition. They debate sending a portion of the fleet back for supplies while holding the rest at Takashima, but dividing the fleet risks losing control entirely. They consider attempting another assault on Hakata, but the reports from the commanders who led the previous assaults are clear. The wall cannot be breached without siege equipment that the fleet does not have. The invasion is trapped in a logistical death spiral, burning resources it cannot replace, losing men it cannot afford to lose, with no clear path to victory and no acceptable path to retreat. On August 14th, 1281, the sky over Takashima begins to change. The wind shifts to the south, the temperature drops, dark clouds build on the horizon. Experienced Korean sailors on the fleet recognize the signs. A major storm is approaching, likely a typhoon. They warn the Mongol commanders that the fleet needs to find shelter immediately, either by moving to a protected harbour or by sailing away from the coast into open ocean where there is room to manoeuvre. But there is no protected harbour large enough to hold the fleet, and sailing into open ocean in the face of an approaching storm is just as dangerous as staying anchored. The commanders make the worst possible choice. They order the fleet to remain at anchor and ride out the storm. The typhoon strikes on the morning of August 15th. The wind arrives first, building gradually through the early hours, then hitting with full force by midday. The anchored ships begin to rock violently. Anchors drag across the seabed as the wind pushes the vessels backward. Crews scramble to secure rigging and batten down hatches, but there is little they can do. The wind is too strong. The waves are rising higher than the masts. Ships begin to collide, driven together by the wind and waves, splintering hulls and snapping masts. Some vessels break free from their anchors and are driven toward shore, smashing onto rocks or running aground on the beaches. Others capsize in open water, dragged under by the weight of their cargo, and the men trapped below decks. The storm lasts for 2 days. The rain is so heavy that visibility drops to a few yards. The wind howls at over 100 miles per hour, tearing sails from their rigging and ripping apart wooden hulls. The waves are monstrous, 30 feet high, crashing over the decks and washing men overboard. Thousands of soldiers drown in the first hours, dragged down by their armour or crushed between colliding ships. The survivors cling to wreckage, to masts, to anything that floats, but the sea is merciless. By the time the storm passes on August 17th, more than half the Mongol fleet is destroyed. Over 2,000 ships are sunk, wrecked, or damaged beyond repair. Between 70 and 90,000 men are dead, drowned in the storm or killed in the chaos that follows. The survivors are scattered across Takashima and the nearby coast, separated from their ships, with no supplies and no way to organize a defense. The Mongol command structure has collapsed. Generals and officers are missing, presumed dead. The soldiers who made it to shore are exhausted, starving, and defenseless. They have no weapons, no armor, no food. They wait on the beaches hoping for rescue that will not come. While the 11:43 p.m. Japanese forces move in quickly, taking advantage of the Mongol collapse. Samurai units from Kyushu, organized under the coordinated command structure that Hojo Tokimun established after the first invasion, sweep across Takashima and the nearby coastline. There is no formal battle. The Mongols are in no position to fight. What follows is a systematic hunt. Japanese soldiers search the beaches, the forests, the caves where survivors are hiding. Mongol soldiers, weakened by weeks at sea and the typhoon, offer little resistance. Some attempt to surrender. The Japanese, remembering the massacres at Tsushima and Iki in 1274, show no mercy. Thousands of Mongol and Korean soldiers are executed on the beaches. Others are captured and enslaved. A few escape by stealing damaged boats and attempting the crossing back to Korea, but most of these drown or are lost at sea. The scale of the slaughter is difficult to comprehend. Over the course of a week, Japanese forces kill or capture tens of thousands of men. The beaches of Takashima are littered with bodies. The water offshore is choked with wreckage and corpses. The few Mongol commanders who survive the storm and escape back to Korea carry reports of total disaster. Of the 140,000 men who sailed with the invasion fleet, fewer than 30,000 return. The rest are dead, captured, or missing. It is one of the worst military catastrophes in history, comparable to the destruction of the Spanish Armada 3 centuries later, or the annihilation of Napoleon's army in Russia. Kublai Khan receives the news in his capital at Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing. The initial reports are fragmentary and confused. Messengers arrive with conflicting accounts of storms, Japanese resistance, and fleet losses. As more survivors straggle back and the full scope of the disaster becomes clear, Kublai is forced to confront the reality that his invasion of Japan has failed catastrophically. He has lost over 100,000 men, thousands of ships, and years of accumulated resources. The Mongol Empire, which has never failed to conquer a major target, has been defeated by a combination of Japanese resistance and logistical overreach. Kublai's first reaction is fury. He orders his generals to prepare a third invasion, larger and better organized than the first two. He demands that shipyards across China and Korea begin constructing a new fleet immediately. He threatens to execute commanders who failed in their duties during the 1281 invasion. But as planning for the third invasion begins, the practical problems become impossible to ignore. The cost of building another fleet is staggering. China's coastal provinces are already exhausted from the demands of the 1281 campaign. The loss of experienced sailors and ship captains means that even if the ships can be built, there are not enough skilled crews to man them. Most critically, there is no clear strategy for overcoming the defensive wall at Hakata Bay. The 1281 invasion failed not because of lack of effort or courage, but because the Japanese had redesigned the battlefield in a way that negated Mongol advantages. A third invasion would face the same problems unless the Mongols could develop a way to breach fortified coastal defences from the sea. Kublai's advisors begin to push back against the plan. They point out that Japan is a secondary target, less strategically important than consolidating control over China, where resistance to Mongol rule is still simmering. They argue that the resources required for another invasion would be better spent securing the empire's existing holdings. They note that the logistics of amphibious warfare across open ocean are beyond the Mongol Empire's capacity to sustain. Kublai resists these arguments at first, but over time the practicalities wear him down. By 1283, planning for the third invasion has quietly stopped. By 1286, it is clear that no third invasion will happen. Kublai turns his attention to other matters: campaigns in Southeast Asia, administrative reforms in China, consolidating his dynasty. Japan is left alone, the one major conquest that the Mongol Empire attempted and failed to achieve. The Japanese, meanwhile, interpret their survival as divine intervention. The storm that destroyed the Mongol fleet becomes known as the kamikaze, the divine wind, sent by the gods to protect Japan from foreign invasion. This narrative takes hold quickly and becomes central to Japanese identity. Shrines are built to honor the gods who saved the nation. The samurai who defended Hakata Bay are celebrated as heroes. The story of the kamikaze is passed down through generations, reinforced by priests and chroniclers, and eventually becomes one of the defining myths of Japanese history. When Japan faces the threat of Western colonial powers in the 19th century, the memory of the kamikaze reassures the Japanese that their islands are protected by divine favor. When Japan goes to war in the 20th century, the kamikaze myth is invoked again, this time lending its name to suicide pilots who believe they are emulating the divine winds that saved their ancestors. But the myth obscures the reality. The storm did destroy the Mongol fleet, but the storm struck a fleet that was already failing. The invasion was collapsing before the typhoon hit, undone by the wall at Hakata Bay, by the logistical impossibility of sustaining a massive amphibious force, by the nighttime raids that eroded Mongol strength, and by the inability of Mongol commanders to adapt to a kind of warfare they had never encountered. The divine wind narrative gives credit to the gods, but the real credit belongs to Hojo Tokimune and the strategic decisions he made after the 1274 invasion. The wall, the centralized command structure, the stockpiling of supplies, the reorganization of defenses. These were human decisions, practical and unsexy, but they were what saved Japan. This distinction matters because it reveals a fundamental truth about military success and failure. Superior technology, superior tactics, and superior numbers are not enough if you cannot bring them to bear on the battlefield. The Mongols had all three, but they could not land their forces, could not establish a base, could not sustain their logistics. The Japanese did not need to defeat the Mongols in open battle. They only needed to deny the Mongols the conditions that would allow their superiority to function. The wall was the tool that did this. It turned Hakata Bay into a fortress, forced the Mongols to fight from a position of weakness, and bought time for logistics to collapse the invasion from within. The lesson here is that defense is not about matching the enemy's strengths. It is about changing the battlefield so that the enemy's strengths become irrelevant. The Japanese could not build an army that matched the Mongol cavalry. They could not develop weapons that outranged Mongol bows. They could not coordinate their forces as effectively as Mongol units. But they could build a wall. They could dig in. They could force the Mongols to assault a fortified position from the sea, where cavalry could not charge, where coordination was impossible, and where every advantage the Mongols possessed disappeared. This is the strategic insight that won the war, and it is the insight that has been forgotten beneath the myth of the divine wind. Now let us consider what this means in broader terms. The Mongol invasions of Japan are often treated as an isolated event, a footnote in the larger story of Mongol expansion. But they are more than that. They represent the outer limit of what the Mongol military system could achieve. The Mongols conquered everything they could reach on horseback. They adapted to siege warfare and conquered walled cities. They crossed rivers, mountains, and deserts. But they could not sustain a major amphibious invasion across open ocean against a fortified defender. This was the boundary of their power, the point where logistics and geography defeated even the most successful military system in medieval history. The boundary that stopped the Mongols at Japan is not unique to them. It is a pattern that repeats throughout history whenever a dominant military power attempts to project force across water against prepared resistance. The Romans, despite controlling the Mediterranean, never successfully invaded and held Ireland or northern Scotland, where the logistical challenges of amphibious operations outweighed the strategic benefit. The Spanish Armada in 1588 failed to invade England not because Spanish ships were inferior, but because sustaining an invasion fleet in hostile waters while coordinating with land forces proved impossible. Napoleon abandoned plans to invade Britain in 1805 for the same reason. Even with naval supremacy, landing and sustaining an army across the Channel against entrenched defenders was too risky. The Mongols in 1281 faced the same fundamental problem. Water creates a logistical barrier that no amount of tactical superiority can overcome if the defender is prepared and willing to contest the landing. What makes the Japanese case especially instructive is how quickly they identified the problem and implemented a solution. After the 1274 invasion, the Japanese leadership had 7 years to prepare. They used that time not to train better warriors or develop new weapons, but to build infrastructure that changed the terms of engagement. The wall at Hakata Bay was not a brilliant tactical innovation. Walls have existed since the beginning of warfare, but it was the right tool for the specific problem Japan faced. The Mongols excelled at maneuver. The wall eliminated maneuver. The Mongols relied on coordinated cavalry charges. The wall made cavalry charges impossible. The Mongols used massed archery to suppress defenders. The wall provided cover that negated suppressing fire. Every advantage the Mongols brought to the battlefield was nullified by a simple stone barrier. The broader lesson is about adaptation. The Japanese did not try to become Mongols. They did not attempt to copy Mongol tactics or reorganize their entire military system around Mongol principles. Instead, they analyzed what made the Mongols dangerous and designed a defensive strategy that made those dangers irrelevant. This is a fundamentally different approach from trying to match an enemy's strengths, and it is often more effective. Matching strengths leads to attrition. Whoever has more resources, better training, or superior technology eventually wins. Changing the battlefield leads to asymmetric advantage. The weaker side can win by forcing the stronger side to fight in conditions that favor the defender. Consider how this principle applies beyond medieval Japan. In the 20th century, Vietnam defeated the United States not by building an air force that could match American bombers, but by fighting a guerrilla war in jungle terrain where air superiority mattered less. Afghanistan resisted Soviet occupation not by fielding tank divisions, but by using mountain terrain and decentralized resistance to make Soviet mechanized warfare ineffective. In both cases, the weaker side recognized that they could not win by fighting on the enemy's terms, so they changed the terms. They made the battlefield inhospitable to the enemy's advantages. This is what Japan did in 1281, and it is what made the difference between survival and conquest. The question remains, why did the Mongols not adapt? They had proven themselves capable of learning and adjusting to new challenges throughout their expansion. When they first encountered walled cities in China, they learned siege warfare. When they faced heavy cavalry in Europe, they developed tactics to counter armoured knights. Why did they not develop a solution to fortified coastal defences? The answer lies in the nature of the problem. Siege warfare and cavalry tactics are challenges that can be solved with training, equipment, and tactical innovation. Amphibious logistics are a structural problem that requires infrastructure the Mongols did not have and could not easily build. They needed a reliable way to transport and sustain massive forces over water, and that required a naval tradition, shipbuilding expertise, and supply systems that took centuries to develop. The Mongols were land-based nomads who had adapted brilliantly to continental warfare. Naval warfare was outside their core competency, and 7 years was not enough time to close that gap. The 1281 invasion represents the Mongol Empire's most ambitious attempt to overcome this limitation, and its failure reveals the costs of operating beyond your logistical capacity. The fleet that sailed to Japan in 1281 was enormous, but size does not equal capability. The ships were hastily built, the crews were inexperienced, and the supply system was inadequate for the scale of the operation. The invasion force was large enough to overwhelm Japanese defences in theory, but in practice it could not even establish a beachhead. The logistical requirements of feeding, supplying, and coordinating 140,000 men across open ocean exceeded what the Mongol Empire could sustainably manage. The invasion did not fail because the Japanese were stronger. It failed because the Mongols bit off more than they could chew. This is a recurring pattern in military history. Overextension kills empires. Rome collapsed in part because it could not sustain its borders against constant pressure from Germanic tribes, Persians, and internal rebellions. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 destroyed the Grand Army not through decisive battles, but through the slow erosion of supply lines stretched beyond breaking. The German Wehrmacht in World War II reached the gates of Moscow, but could not sustain the advance because supply lines from Germany were too long and too vulnerable. In each case, the attacking force was powerful enough to win battles, but not powerful enough to sustain the campaign. The Mongol invasion of Japan in 1281 fits this pattern perfectly. The Mongols won every battle at Tsushima and Iki. They had numerical superiority at Hakata Bay. They had better weapons, better coordination, and a reputation that terrified their enemies. But none of that mattered, because they could not sustain their presence on Japanese soil long enough to exploit their advantages. The wall forced them to fight from the sea, and fighting from the sea meant burning through supplies they could not replace. Every day the invasion stalled was a day closer to collapse. The typhoon accelerated the collapse, but it did not cause it. The invasion was already dying when the storm hit. Now consider the human cost. Over 100,000 men died in the 1281 invasion, drowned in the typhoon, killed in the failed assaults on Hakata Bay, executed on the beaches of Takashima, or lost to disease and starvation aboard the ships. Most of these men were not Mongols. They were Chinese conscripts, Korean soldiers, and sailors from coastal provinces who had no stake in Kublai Khan's ambitions. They died not for their own kingdoms, but for an empire that had conquered their homelands and forced them into service. This is the other side of the Mongol success story, the staggering human cost paid by the peoples they subjugated. The Mongol military machine was effective because it mobilized the resources of entire conquered populations. When it failed, those populations paid the price. The Japanese casualties were lower but still significant. Thousands of samurai and foot soldiers died defending Tsushima, Iki, and Hakata Bay. The civilian population of the outer islands was massacred when the Mongols landed in 1274 and again in 1281. The economic cost of building the wall and maintaining the defense over 7 years strained Kyushu's resources to breaking. But Japan survived, and the survival came at a cost that was bearable compared to the alternative. Conquest by the Mongol Empire meant subjugation, tribute, forced military service, and the loss of sovereignty. The Japanese paid a high price to avoid that fate, but they judged it worth paying. There is one final aspect of this story that deserves attention: the role of leadership. There is one final aspect of this story that deserves attention: the role of leadership. Hojo Tokimune, the regent who oversaw Japan's defense, was 23 years old when the first Mongol invasion struck in 1274. He was 30 when the second invasion arrived in 1281. By medieval standards, he was young for a leader facing an existential threat, but his decisions were pragmatic and effective. Tokimune did not rely on samurai tradition or divine intervention. He recognized that Japan's existing military system was inadequate to stop the Mongols, and he took concrete steps to fix the problem: the wall, the centralized command structure, The supply stockpiles, the reorganization of coastal defences. These were administrative and logistical reforms, not dramatic battlefield heroics. They were the kind of decisions that do not make for exciting legends, but they are the decisions that win wars. Tokimune understood something that many leaders fail to grasp. Preparation matters more than valour. The samurai who died defending Tsushima and Iki in 1274 were brave, but bravery alone did not stop the Mongols. The wall stopped the Mongols. The logistics that sustained Japanese defenders behind the wall stopped the Mongols. The nighttime raids that degraded Mongol morale and reduced their effective strength stopped the Mongols. All of these required planning, resources, and sustained effort over years. Tokimune provided that leadership. He mobilized the labor force to build the wall. He organized the command structure to ensure coordination. He stockpiled supplies so that defenders could hold out during a prolonged siege. These are not the actions of a warrior hero. They are the actions of an effective administrator who understood that war is won through preparation and logistics, not just through fighting. Compare this to the Mongol leadership during the invasions. The commanders of the eastern and southern route armies were experienced generals who had led successful campaigns across Asia, but they were operating under constraints that made success nearly impossible. Kublai Khan demanded results, but did not provide the logistical support necessary to achieve them. The fleet was hastily assembled, the supply system was inadequate, and the coordination between the two invasion forces was poor. The generals on the ground recognized this is a common problem in military history. Commanders in the field often understand the limitations of their position better than political leaders far from the front lines, but they lack the authority to make strategic decisions. The German generals in World War II knew the invasion of the Soviet Union was overextended, but Hitler insisted on pushing forward. The American generals in Vietnam knew the war was unwinnable under the political constraints they operated under, but Washington kept sending more troops. The Mongol generals in 1281 knew the invasion was failing, but Kublai Khan expected conquest, so they kept throwing men at the wall until the typhoon ended the campaign. Leadership failures at the strategic level doom tactical excellence at the operational level. The contrast with Tokimune is striking. He had the authority to make strategic decisions and the judgment to make the right ones. He did not insist on defending Japan through traditional samurai warfare because tradition demanded it. He built the wall because it was the most effective solution to the problem Japan faced. When the wall succeeded and the Mongol invasion collapsed, Tokimune did not declare victory and dismantle the defences. He kept the wall standing and maintained the defensive preparations for years afterward, in case the Mongols returned. This is the mark of a serious leader, someone who understands that the threat does not end just because one invasion failed, and who plans for the long term rather than reacting to immediate crises. After the 1281 invasion, Tokimune continued to govern Japan for another 3 years. He maintained the coastal defences, reorganized the administrative system, and prepared for the possibility of a third Mongol attack. When it became clear by the mid-1280s that Kublai Khan was not going to launch another invasion, Tokimune shifted focus to internal governance and economic recovery. The cost of the wars had strained Japan's economy, and the samurai who fought at Hakata Bay expected rewards for their service. Tokimune worked to balance those demands against the need to maintain readiness. He died in 1284 at the age of 33, likely from illness, leaving behind a Japan that had survived the greatest military threat it would face until the modern era. The long-term consequences of the Mongol invasions shaped Japanese history for centuries. The success of the defense reinforced the idea that Japan was divinely protected, which contributed to a sense of cultural exceptionalism that persisted into the 20th century. The kamikaze myth became so entrenched that by World War II, Japanese military leaders genuinely believed that divine intervention would save Japan from defeat, even when the strategic situation was hopeless. This belief contributed to disastrous decisions like the kamikaze suicide attacks, which were named after the divine wind of 1281 but achieved nothing except the deaths of thousands of young pilots. The myth that saved Japan in 1281 became a delusion that contributed to Japan's destruction in 1945. But the myth also obscured the real lessons of the Mongol invasions. The lesson was not that Japan was divinely protected. The lesson was that intelligent preparation, structural defences and logistical planning can defeat even the most powerful military force if the defender understands the battlefield and redesigns it to negate the attacker's advantages. This lesson was forgotten because the kamikaze narrative was more emotionally satisfying. It is easier to believe in divine intervention than to credit boring administrative reforms like building a wall and stockpiling supplies. But the boring administrative reforms were what actually worked. The Mongol perspective on the failed invasions is harder to reconstruct because the Mongol sources are sparse. Chinese chronicles written under the Yuan dynasty, which Kublai Khan founded, mention the invasions but downplay the failure. Later, Mongol and Chinese historians treat the Japan campaigns as a minor footnote in the larger story of Mongol expansion. This makes sense from the Mongol point of view. Japan was a distant island with limited strategic value, and the failure to conquer it did not threaten the empire's core holdings in China and Central Asia. But the failure mattered more than the Mongol sources suggest. It marked the first time the Mongol Empire encountered a target it could not conquer through military force. It revealed the limits of Mongol logistics and the vulnerability of Mongol amphibious operations, and it demonstrated that fortified defense, properly organized, could stop even the most formidable army in the world. The broader strategic lesson applies far beyond medieval Japan. Military power is not absolute, it is contextual. A military system that dominates in one environment can fail completely in another. The Mongols were unbeatable on the open steppes and plains of Asia, where their cavalry could maneuver freely. They were highly effective in siege warfare once they adapted and recruited engineers. But they were vulnerable in amphibious operations, where logistics mattered more than tactics and where fortified coastal defences could negate their mobility. Understanding these contextual limits is critical for both attackers and defenders. Attackers must recognise when they are operating outside their effective range and either adapt their approach or choose different targets. Defenders must recognise where the attacker is vulnerable and design their strategy to exploit those vulnerabilities. Japan in 1281 exploited the Mongol vulnerability perfectly. The wall at Hakata Bay was not a miracle. It was a calculated response to a specific threat, built over 7 years through sustained effort and resources. It worked because it addressed the core problem. The Mongols needed a landing site where they could deploy their forces and bring their tactical advantages to bear, and the wall denied them that landing site. Without the wall, the Mongols might have established a beachhead, pushed inland, and ground down Japanese resistance through attrition. With the wall, they were stuck fighting from ships, burning supplies they could not replace, and losing men to nighttime raids and disease. The wall changed the battlefield, and changing the battlefield changed the outcome of the war. This principle of battlefield redesign extends beyond physical fortifications. It applies to any situation where a weaker force faces a stronger opponent. The key is identifying what makes the opponent strong, and then removing the conditions that allow that strength to function. In modern terms, this is called asymmetric warfare, but the concept is ancient. The Greeks at Thermopylae in 480 BC used a narrow mountain pass to negate the numerical superiority of the Persian army. The Vietnamese in the 1960s and 1970s used jungle terrain and guerrilla tactics to negate American technological and firepower advantages. The Afghans in the 1980s used mountain warfare and decentralized resistance to bleed the Soviet military. In each case, the defending force could not win a conventional battle, so they refused to fight a conventional battle. They changed the terms of engagement. The Japanese in 1281 did the same thing. They could not defeat the Mongols in open combat, so they built a wall that made open combat unnecessary. They could not match Mongol naval power, so they used small boats for nighttime raids that exploited the vulnerability of a large fleet at anchor. They could not outlast the Mongol Empire in a prolonged war of attrition, so they designed a defensive strategy that forced the Mongols to outlast their own logistics. Every element of the Japanese strategy was about refusing to fight the war the Mongols wanted to fight, and instead imposing a different kind of war, one where Japanese advantages in defensive preparation and local knowledge outweighed Mongol advantages in mobility and coordination. This approach requires discipline and patience. It is tempting when facing an overwhelming threat to respond with aggression and try to match the enemy's strength. The samurai tradition emphasized individual combat and aggressive charges, exactly the kind of tactics that got Japanese warriors killed at Tsushima Iniki in 1274. Tokimun's genius was recognizing that tradition had to give way to practicality. The samurai who defended Hakata Bay in 1281 did not fight the way their fathers and grandfathers had fought. They fought from behind walls, using coordinated archery and defensive positions, waiting for the Mongols to exhaust themselves against fortifications. This was not glorious or honourable by traditional samurai standards, but it worked. There is a related lesson about the value of learning from failure. The 1274 invasion was a disaster for Japan. The outer islands fell quickly. The defenders at Hakata Bay were overwhelmed. Only the Mongol withdrawal and the storm prevented total defeat. But Japan learned from that disaster. The survivors who escaped Tsushima and Iki reported back on Mongol tactics: the explosive bombs, the coordinated infantry, the massed archery. The samurai who fought at Hakata Bay saw firsthand how Mongol units operated. All of this intelligence informed the defensive preparations that followed. The wall was designed specifically to counter the tactics the Mongols had used in 1274. The reorganized command structure addressed the coordination failures that had plagued Japanese forces during the first invasion. The supply stockpiles ensured that defenders would not run out of arrows and provisions during a prolonged battle. Every reform was a direct response to a problem identified in 1274. Contrast this with the Mongol approach. The Mongols learned from the 1274 invasion as well. They knew Japan would resist and that a larger force was needed. But they did not fundamentally rethink their strategy. The 1281 invasion was the 1274 invasion scaled up, with more ships and more men but the same basic approach: land at Hakata Bay, overwhelm the defenders through superior numbers and tactics, establish a beachhead, push inland. The Mongols did not anticipate the wall because they had no experience with fortified coastal defences designed specifically to stop an amphibious landing. They assumed that what had worked everywhere else, overwhelming force combined with superior coordination, would work in Japan. When it did not, they had no fallback plan. This points to a deeper issue with the Mongol military system. It was extraordinarily effective within the parameters it was designed for, but it was not particularly flexible when those parameters changed. Mongol tactics worked brilliantly on the steppes and plains, reasonably well in siege warfare once they adapted, and adequately in forested or mountainous terrain. But amphibious warfare required a completely different set of capabilities: naval logistics, supply lines across open water, the ability to sustain forces without access to forage or local resources. The Mongols tried to apply their land-based military system to a naval campaign, and it did not translate. They needed to develop new capabilities, and 7 years between invasions was not enough time to do so. The failure to adapt cost the Mongol Empire more than just the loss of Japan. It marked the beginning of the end of Mongol expansion. After 1281, the Mongol Empire fought no more major campaigns of conquest. Kublai Khan focused on consolidating control over China and suppressing internal rebellions. His successors dealt with fragmentation and decline. The empire that had seemed unstoppable in the 1240s and 1250s had reached its limits by the 1280s. The failed invasion of Japan was not the cause of that decline, but it was a symptom. The Mongols had expanded as far as their logistical and organizational capacity could sustain. Beyond that boundary, they could not project power effectively. Japan, meanwhile, entered a period of relative isolation. The threat of Mongol invasion had forced the Japanese to centralize military authority and build coastal defenses, but once the threat passed, those reforms began to erode. The Kamakura shogunate, which had ruled Japan during the invasions, eventually fell in the 1330s, partly because of the economic strain caused by the wars, and partly because of internal political conflicts. The wall at Hakata Bay stood for decades but was eventually neglected and fell into disrepair. The memory of the invasions remained strong, but the practical military lessons were gradually forgotten. By the time European ships arrived in Japanese waters in the 16th century, Japan had no organized coastal defenses and no coherent strategy for dealing with foreign naval threats. The lessons of 1281 had to be relearned. The broader historical significance of the Mongol invasions lies in what they reveal about the limits of military power and the importance of logistics. Empires rise when they develop military systems that give them advantages over their neighbours. They expand as long as those advantages remain relevant and their logistics can sustain the expansion. They stop expanding when they encounter enemies who negate their advantages or when their logistics can no longer support further campaigns. The Mongol Empire reached that limit at the shores of Japan. The military system that conquered half of Eurasia could not conquer a fortified island. So what can we take from this? What does the story of Tsushima and the Mongol invasions teach us that applies beyond medieval Japan? So what can we take from this? What does the story of Tsushima and the Mongol invasions teach us that applies beyond medieval Japan? The answer is both simple and profound. Wars are not won by the side with the best warriors or the most advanced weapons. Wars are won by the side that best understands the battlefield and designs a strategy that exploits its advantages while negating the enemy's strengths. This sounds obvious, but it is surprising how often military leaders forget it. They focus on matching enemy capabilities, building bigger armies, developing better technology, training more elite units, when the real solution is to change the nature of the conflict itself. The Japanese in 1281 changed the nature of the conflict. They turned an amphibious invasion into a siege. They turned a battle of maneuver into a battle of attrition. They forced the Mongols to fight from a position of weakness, anchored at sea, burning through irreplaceable supplies, unable to bring their cavalry and coordination to bear. The wall at Hakata Bay was the tool that accomplished this, but the wall alone was not enough. It had to be combined with centralized command, adequate supplies, trained defenders, and the willingness to hold the line under bombardment and assault. All of these elements had to work together, and they only worked because Hojo Tokimune understood what was required and mobilized the resources to make it happen. The Mongol failure, by contrast, was a failure of strategic adaptation. The Mongols recognized that Japan would be difficult to conquer, so they assembled the largest invasion force in their history. But they did not rethink their fundamental approach. They assumed that overwhelming force would be sufficient, that Japanese resistance would collapse once Mongol superiority became clear, and that the logistics of the campaign would work themselves out. None of those assumptions held. The Japanese did not collapse. The Mongol superiority could not be brought to bear against fortified defences, and the logistics did not work out. In fact, logistics became the decisive factor that doomed the invasion even before the typhoon struck. This pattern appears again and again in military history. The Germans in World War I assumed that the Schlieffen Plan would deliver a quick victory over France, but they did not account for logistical limitations or the possibility of effective French resistance. The plan failed, and Germany spent 4 years in a grinding war of attrition it could not win. The United States and Vietnam assumed that superior firepower and technology would break North Vietnamese resistance, but North Vietnam changed the nature of the conflict through guerrilla warfare, and American advantages became irrelevant. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan assumed that mechanized warfare would crush Afghan resistance, but the Afghans fought a decentralized insurgency in mountain terrain, and Soviet mechanization became a liability rather than an asset. In every case, the stronger power failed because it tried to impose its preferred kind of warfare on an enemy that refused to cooperate. The weaker side won by recognizing that it could not win on the stronger side's terms, and by designing a strategy that made the stronger side's advantages irrelevant. This is what Japan did in 1281, and it is the most important lesson of the Mongol invasions. You do not need to be stronger than your enemy. You need to make your enemy's strength useless. There is also a lesson about the importance of preparation and timing. The wall at Hakata Bay took 7 years to build. 7 years is a long time to sustain a major construction project, especially when there is no immediate threat and when resources are limited. But those 7 years made the difference between survival and conquest. If the Mongols had returned in 1276 or 1277, before the wall was complete, the outcome might have been different. If the Japanese had delayed construction or built the wall poorly, it might not have held against the 1281 assault. Timing mattered, and timing was a function of leadership, organization, and sustained effort over years. This is not dramatic or exciting, but it is how wars are won in reality rather than in legend. The role of the typhoon in all of this remains complicated. The storm did destroy the Mongol fleet, and without the storm some portion of the invasion force might have survived and regrouped for another assault. But the invasion was already collapsing before the storm hit. The wall had stopped the landing. The nighttime raids had degraded Mongol strength. The supply shortages had crippled the fleet's ability to sustain operations. The Mongol commanders were debating withdrawal even before the typhoon struck. The storm delivered the final blow, but it struck an enemy that was already defeated in everything but name. To credit the storm alone is to miss the point. The storm was the end of the story, not the cause of the outcome. This matters because it affects how we understand the relationship between chance and strategy in warfare. Chance plays a role, weather, disease, accidents, unforeseen events all influence outcomes. But chance favours the prepared. The typhoon destroyed the Mongol fleet because the fleet was anchored in open water, exposed and vulnerable, with no room to manoeuvre. The fleet was in that position because the Mongol invasion had failed to secure a beachhead and was trapped in a logistical collapse. The invasion failed because the Japanese had built defences that negated Mongol tactical advantages. The defences worked because Japanese leadership made intelligent strategic decisions and sustained those decisions over 7 years. Trace the chain of causation backward, and you find that the outcome was determined not by divine intervention, but by human decisions, preparation, and structural factors. The Mongol invasions of Japan stand as a testament to what defensive preparation can achieve against overwhelming odds. The Mongols were the greatest military power of the 13th century with a record of conquest unmatched in history. They defeated every major opponent they faced: the Chinese dynasties, the Khwarezmian Empire, the Russian principalities, the Kingdom of Hungary. They were not defeated in Japan by superior warriors or secret weapons. They were defeated by a wall, by nighttime raids, by the logistical impossibility of sustaining an amphibious invasion against a prepared defender. They were defeated by intelligent strategy, sustained effort, and the recognition that you do not beat the Mongols by fighting like Mongols. You beat them by making them fight on your terms, in conditions where their advantages disappear. This is the lesson of Tsushima and the Battle of Hakata Bay. It is a lesson about logistics, preparation, and strategic adaptation. It is a lesson about the limits of military power and the importance of understanding the battlefield. It is a lesson that has been forgotten beneath the myth of the divine wind, but it is a lesson worth remembering. Because in the end, wars are not decided by gods or miracles. They are decided by commanders who understand what their forces can and cannot do, by defenders who prepare for the worst and build the infrastructure to survive it, and by the brutal reality that logistics, not valor, determines who wins and who loses. The samurai who died defending Tsushima and Iki were brave. The warriors who held the wall at Hakata Bay were courageous. But bravery and courage were not enough. The wall was enough. The preparation was enough. The understanding that Japan could not fight the Mongols on Mongol terms was enough. Hojo Tokimune understood this, and his understanding saved Japan from conquest. The kamikaze destroyed the fleet, but the strategy defeated the invasion. That is the story that deserved to be remembered. If you found this deep dive into the Mongol invasions valuable, let me know in the comments what other campaigns or battles you'd like to see examined through this strategic lens. And if you made it this far, you've earned that subscribe button.